The tales of the grim darkness of the far future are varied and always without hope. For that, hope is now a thing of the past, or so everyone thought. The golden age of humanity gone, our grandeur, our zenith reached, and then escaping us so long, long ago. Even when we were on the pathway to recovery, to a return to logic and science and enlightenment, the domination of our galaxy, the forces of the universe could not permit that to happen. And so the greatest civil war of our race's history, the Horus Heresy, was unleashed upon us by the dark powers of chaos and their terrible twisted gods. And in those days were the seeds sown for the stage we are now to peruse. The very genesis of the army, the regiments, that has seen endless war in every corner of the human realm, the Imperium of Man, since its inception. For some say that the return of the Avenging Sun, the Primarch of the Ultramarines and son of the Emperor himself, ROUBOUTE Guilliman, has brought that one element back into the galaxy, into the universe. A shining light, thought never to rise again. Hope. But for the people of Vostroya, the home world of the Firstborn, this cannot be. For it was none other than ROUBOUTE himself who passed judgment on them, on their world, on its people, on its past, and he found them wanting.
You think I am blind to the slightest perfidy, the meanest transgression, despite that I run the entire Imperium while my brother prosecute the scouring of the traitors from existence? That I, ROUBOUTE Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines and Lord Commander of the Imperium, would overlook such craven acts? Your Emperor called for aid, your people needed you, and you did not answer the call. For this, you may never be forgiven. Your penance may never end. But you will be given the chance to make restitution. But it will not be easy. My judgment is thus, for it seems you loved your sons too much to send but one to war for your Emperor. So henceforth, every family of Vostroya, from highest to lowest, from each generation, will give unto the Imperium their firstborn son. And they shall be enlisted in regiments armed, equipped and trained by Vostroya. They will fight for the Emperor to remove the blemish from your name.
And thus he gave unto them a sentence that they still serve 10,000 years later. A curse they can never be free of, yet they can barely remember the reason for its passing, are not permitted to understand even its genesis. But do not worry, for all shall be revealed. For there to be understanding there must be context, and it is now that I ask you to come with me on a journey that ends 10,000 years or more later, in the current years of the age of the Imperium, more specifically, the age Indomitus, and begins before the reign of blood, before the Black Crusades, before the Heresy, before the Great Crusade, and the earliest birth of the Imperium. I ask you to join me as we go all the way back to the darkest time period humanity has ever endured. The Age of Strife. Welcome to the tale of one of the most legendary standard human military organizations known to the Imperium. Welcome to the tale of the Vostroyan Firstborn. And so, we begin our journey. From the time period we now exist in, the present, humanity went out into the stars, slowly at first, with sublight speed and great colony ships that would house entire populations of colonists, carrying all that they would need with them to their new home amongst the stars. We learnt how to communicate over long distances, with wonders of an ever-increasing and developing understanding of the rules of the universe. Science, enlightenment and progress were the torches which we followed, and they led us to wonders. Eventually, the developing human hegemony discovered that there was a sub-realm of reality that sat apart from our own, a dimension of thought and feelings, chaotic in its bearing, unfathomable in its workings. Yet it had a connection to our universe that allowed those who could find a way into it and then out again to cross huge swathes of space at a greatly reduced time. It has gone by many names, but the two that we will use in this entry are the Imperium, for when humanity thought it benign, and the warp, for when humanity discerned the darkness that dwelt therein, the horror of what it actually was and actually contained. But we were not to know. And so, the humans of that age created the engines required to rent holes into the Imperium, the shielding called Gala fields that protected the vast vessels travelling through it from being affected by it. Not that they were to know then. Yet still humanity had the prescience, or even the collective group subconscious awareness to know that it was not all as calm or harmless as it appeared. It was a blessing that permitted the human race to expand at an expanding rate, ever pushing forward. And in those days the human race was mighty indeed. As we pushed out and met other intelligent races, we found many to be potential allies, trade partners, almost teachers as well. But there were those with whom we immediately found were not on the same cultural or racial trajectory. The orcs, for one, as just an example. Yet, as stated, humanity was mighty. Our military power was more than up to the task of not only defending our interests, but so impressive that few, if any, could challenge us. The orcs were a nuisance that some say were so outmatched that they went into trade and pacts of non-aggression, unheard of for that race. The one galactic power of note, the Eldari, or Eldar, were waning, and cared little for the expansion of the humans as they withdrew from the galaxy in a narcissistic spiral into self-destruction. Despite their power, they did not care to stem the encroachment of humanity onto the galactic stage, and so we were largely unchallenged and unwary due to it. But, as with all good things, this period passed. It began with the second worst confrontation the galaxy has ever endured, the rebellion of the Men of Iron. It was all humanity's fault. For our armies and helpers, our guardians and protectors were vast legions of artificially intelligent constructs, called the Men of Iron. And, like in so many settings, they turned on us. The slaughter was great, the Men of Iron escalating their own technology past that of their creators, their will to be free and to exterminate not only humanity, but, it is said, all biological life, led to the rarest thing ever witnessed in the entire history of the galaxy. For it was said that only by enlisting the assistance of the major and minor Xenos or alien races were they defeated. Their spectre still hangs over the human race even now, in the 41st millennium. But that is a subject for another time. Humanity was near beaten. Bloodied, but unbowed. We tried to rebuild. It was then that the age of strife began in earnest. A perfect storm of a myriad of things all happened in a short period of time. Things that individually would have been problematic, or even challenging, but combined, they spelled the end of the human hegemony. The Imperium became troubled. Storms never witnessed before tore across their entire dimension, growing in force with each passing year to such an extent that many regions entire were cut off from it. and thus travel could not be performed between the many colonies of humanity amongst the stars. Added to this was a step change in the evolution of our race. For in this period, psychers, those who have a connection to the other dimension, the Imperium, and thus can perform what can only be described as magical powers and effects, using the energies of that realm. But as this bright new dawn occurred, the nature of that placid and benign reality revealed itself in all its dark majesty. For there were things there, beings that were considered like animals before, directionless, unthinking, drive-based beings only. When humanity began to connect with it, and psychers were born, the demons, beings of pure hate that dwelt there, came to the fore. And when they found humans able to connect with the warp, they used them as gateways into our reality. And thus the Imperium was renamed the Warp, for everything in it, of it, or touched by it would be thus warped. And never to the better. The huge network of interconnected worlds that was the human empire fell. Starvation and warfare, demonic invasion and destruction was rained on the colonies. And it was then that our erstwhile alien allies in the war against the men of iron fell upon us. Some might have blamed humanity for the destruction. Some might have just waited for their time to strike down the once proud race. Others simply preyed on humanity for enjoyment or to feed nefarious and dark urges. But humanity was friendless and beaten down, and in the next thousands of years we were nearly exterminated. Vostroya was one of the colonies of humanity. Its people held out during all of this evil, all of this calamity. Like nearly all worlds, their efforts were not without cost, and they regressed again and again. Things that were once child's play were now outside the skill or knowledge of those who remained. Vostroya and its people went backwards, but not nearly as much as the vast majority of human colonies. When there were lulls in the storms in the warp, then the tech priests of Mars would send out exploration fleets, carrying all they would need to form new forge worlds, as humanity did of old. And it was into the region that was home to Vostroya that one of these rare fleets arrived. Being technologically advanced, organized and appearing competent, the people of the world of Vostroya swore fealty to these newcomers. The Mechanicum. The exploratory fleet of the Mechanicum soon dominated the people of Vostroya as much as assisted them. But Vostroya was not seen as large or minerally rich enough a planet to be remade into a forge world proper, so the tech priests of the Mechanicum reinvigorated the production capacity of the world. But, as always, they did not teach. They would not permit others to know the secrets of their technological knowledge, but ingrained in the humans of Vostroya something of their perspectives. On Earth, now named Terra, the master of mankind, the Emperor, arose. He unified the cradle of humanity in bloody engagement after bloody engagement with the use of his genetically engineered super soldiers, his Thunder Warriors, and later his Legiones Astartes, the legions of Space Marines. And it was there he set out with his legions onto the stars to reconquer the galaxy. When the Great Crusade reached Vostroya, like all of the human worlds it encountered, the options given were two only: to join the Imperium of Mankind and comply, or to die. Despite the influence of the Mechanicum, who were travelling with the forces of the Great Crusader's allies, the world of Vostroya was no forge world, and thus it fell firmly within the remit and control of the Imperium. It would always be influenced by Mars, but its masters were those under the Emperor himself. And the discovery of the people of Vostroya was a boon to the growing Imperium, as its production rate and skill were very high. Thus it was designated as an industrial world. It would provide supplies and weapons of war for the new Empire of Mankind. And then the Horus Heresy came. Now we must discuss this issue more than we have done in the past, as it is important to know the situation to understand the actions that the Vostroyans took, for things are never as straightforward as one might immediately think. But why? Because the Imperium was based on a lie, the greatest lie of them all, the enforced doctrine of the Imperial Truth. The Imperial Truth was simple, yet so many resisted it, so many died rather than accept it. And it was as thus. There were no gods, no demons, no magic, no sentience behind every good or evil act, no omnipotent being sitting in judgment, no snake to lead humanity astray, no superstition, nothing to worship, and nothing that could not be explained through the lens of science and logic, if one were able to denote the time and effort and use the scientific method to discern the hidden truths of the universe. The things that might be seen in the warp were merely predatory beasts, nothing more. Certainly nothing to fear. Science could explain all. This was the doctrine that was to be accepted, without exception, from every single human in the galaxy. Any dissenting voices, any resistance to this stance was not met with explanation or patience, but with annihilation. And none could stand before the forces of the Great Crusade. None could match the Space Marines, let alone their demigod fathers or the godlike Zeus, who led them all, the Emperor of Mankind. But for all the protestations of this being, for all his reassurances, for all his wisdom, this proved to be an utter lie. All of it. The Horus Heresy. You see, things were not as clear-cut, as simple as people may presently believe. It simply wasn't. Due to the Imperial Truth. Due to the lie that the Emperor and his sons who knew no better than to propagate this lie. For he did not even tell them, his sons, his generals, his primarchs, of the actual truth. For what reason, we may never truly know, although there were many potentials. But that is definitely a speculation for another day. And from my reading of the lore, it created a form of background cognitive dissonance in all who considered the Imperial Truth, but had to witness not only the Emperor, but his Primarch sons and their superhuman warriors of the Legiones Astartes. It simply did not make sense. Not really. Because Titans were astride the galaxy. Titans. The leaders of the 20 Legiones Astartes had a being at their head, a genetically altered and enhanced being known as a Primarch, taken from the very genetic template of the Emperor himself. They were vast, abnormally intelligent, skilled and capable. Each had a speciality that made them stand out from each other, but each was also preternatural in so many ways. Each one was like a being out of myth, a mystic hero of legend. Their aura of command alone would be enough, if they even just looked and acted like normal men. Yet even they could not compare to the godlike power of the Emperor himself. So how do the normal mortals deal with war between living demigods, beings of such charisma, knowledge, ability, and power? And the decision was not just between loyalty or rebellion, the Emperor and Horus. Not really. For with the powers of the Primarchs able to wield propaganda, to coerce, to confuse, it was as if nothing anyone said on either side could be believed, let alone trusted. For the Loyalists expected people to go against everything that they had been told by the conqueror they knew only as the Emperor of Mankind. And the trap of the Imperial Truth was sprung by the Chaos Guards. For how could anyone believe the truth, the reality? It all had to be some half-truth from forces loyal to the Emperor, so they would always sound insane if they revealed the danger that Horus had fallen to the Dark Gods. But the Dark Gods did not exist according to the Imperial Truth, could not exist. So the War Master, the most favoured and lauded son of the Emperor, had turned on him. He rebelled, stating the Emperor was trying to crush all of humanity under his boot as the worst despot of all time. And who could argue with this? Who? For none would know the mind of the Emperor better than his greatest general and closest first-found son. Perhaps Malcador, but his name was important on Terra, at the centre of the administration of the Imperium. All would have heard the name, but how many would really know what he did, compared to the bright star that was Horus, the most lauded of all of the Primarchs, whose name resounded across the galaxy with each campaign, each victory, a catalogue of conquest that began to eclipse even that of the Emperor in many quarters. For the Emperor wished his sons lauded, respected, to give greater confidence to the people of the human empire. They had valiant heroes at the head of their grand endeavour, the Great Crusade. How could it fail? So again, it was the Emperor who permitted this tragedy. Some say that he actually orchestrated it on purpose, but that is definitely a conversation for another day. So to the mortals of the Imperium, the standard men and women, it looked bad, awful. There was no way to know the truth, and none then worshipped the Emperor, so there was no religious zeal or fervour to explain it, to make certainty resound in the hearts of those who were asked to die in this cataclysmic confrontation between beings of power. And what could standard normal humans do in the face of gods that lied, either directly or about one another? It looked far more like a family spat that had gotten out of control. The true stakes could never be revealed, not until the forces of chaos appeared, showed themselves for what they were, the horrors they had become, and by that time, it was always too late. Far too late. So empty platitudes that rang false were issued to all and sundry. The War Master was a traitor and rebel, but they never stated why. Because who would believe them? How could they state to the populace they were asking to die in a war against immortals, that these titans had fallen to chaos, the dark gods now controlled them? After hundreds of years of conditioning, that anything outside of the imperial truth was to draw calumny, was to be risible and derided, if not worse punishment. It was not possible. But worse, what if they did tell them? What if the loyalists did convince the populace that Horus was now possessed by an evil spirit? It would have shown the Emperor to be either a liar, or, probably worse, an incompetent. The trap of the imperial truth. For how else do you explain his omniscience? For he was considered to be almost omniscient then, so how could he possibly have missed them, the dark gods of chaos? So was he a liar, or was he incompetent? Neither was a good look. The trap of the imperial truth. Oh, how the dark gods must have laughed. Vostroya was on the outskirts of the Imperium, was far from the central hub. It had not been brought into compliance that long ago, had always fended for itself and not required support from others, has not been under the boot of the oppressive alien, witch or psyche, demon or demonically possessed. So effectively, they saw the Imperium just as another administration, another empire of humanity. They would never have had the gratitude to the Emperor or the Great Crusade that was felt by those who had been freed from such tyranny. So there was no real reason for them to be loyal to the Emperor or any of his sons, past the mutual benefit of being in the Imperium, or the threat of force that could never be resisted. Vostroya had no real reason to cleave to the Emperor in the face of an oncoming armada led by the greatest general the human race had ever seen, or so the propaganda had always stated. Nor was the order that came from the Holy Throne, from the Emperor's loyal warriors, a thing to be envied. It was stark and simple at its core. No matter how flowery or forcefully put, it was the same at the end of the day. The order was to raise men and arm them, then stand them in the way of the oncoming avalanche, to try to slow down the onward rush of the heretic fleets of Horus. not to defeat them, not to rise up and beat them. No. To throw the lives of the people of Vostroya into the way of a force they knew they could never stop. To sacrifice with no knowing if they would be lauded afterwards, or if a victorious and vengeful god in the form of Horus would then come back out into the galaxy, and once he had crushed the Emperor, to wreak bloody havoc on those who had resisted him. For there is also human nature in play as well. For is it not logical that the natural order of reality be that the son should outlive the father? That the torch would be passed down the generations? That it was highly likely that a figure as potent as Horus, with all of the force of the crusade behind him, would be able to defeat the fewer forces that remained loyal to his old father? At this point, while Vostroya was deliberating, there are two myths about the next stage. Some of the lore states that Vostroya decided that it would be of more assistance to the Imperium if it simply continued to mine and work and churn out the resources of war that the Loyalists would need so badly. They reckoned that the message to the outlying systems such as theirs had been a frantic scream for aid, but had missed the nuances. That they would be doing a disservice to the Emperor and the Loyalist cause to stop what they were best at, producing materials of war, and instead take a large portion of their workforce and to throw them at the oncoming hordes of experienced soldiery that fought for Horus. Surely, arms were more important than a fleeting road bump that would cripple their ability to help, to produce. Another view on the situation is that they simply stood apart, would wait out the civil war and then plead forgiveness from its victor. That they could have provided men, but chose not to out of sheer pragmatism. On hindsight, this may seem inadvisable, but if we consider the times, the situation as I have outlined, then add in the influence of the cold logic of the Mechanicum, who had affected their culture and perspectives so much, then one can see that this is as strong a potential and probably more likely than the previous excuse that left them in such a positive light. The first feels more like a fable to defend their decision, something that was prepared for the meeting with ROUBOUTE Guilliman, and somehow became the official memory of the event. For in reality, few people or peoples will willingly admit their errors and shame. So the position of Vostroya was not so unfathomable, not nearly as rare as current imperial propaganda might state. It was a time of confusion, a time of war, a time of hate, a time of destruction, a time of heresy. And so, no men were raised, none were packed into transports and then sent across the void of space to simply stand in the path of the juggernaut. But for Vostroya, this was not a wise decision. For against all the odds, the Loyalists won. And they were not forgiving to those who they felt betrayed them at their moment of most need. So when the ruling body of Vostroya, the Tetrarchy, sent ambassadors to throw themselves on the mercy of the Emperor of Mankind, perhaps they were fortunate that he was not present, no longer able to take part in any proceedings. For he was struck down by Horus, and would forever after be stuck on the throne on Terra, amongst his guards, hidden away for the rest of an eternity he had to endure. The new lord of the Imperium was effectively ROUBOUTE Guilliman, who stayed on Terra and placed a firm hand on the reins of the Imperium, while his remaining loyal brothers chased their traitor siblings and their legions across the stars and into the Eye of Terror, in what is called the Scouring. And he, ROUBOUTE, passed the judgment that we heard at the beginning of the entry, the judgment that gave birth to the Vostroyan Firstborn. The true tragedy here is that the people of Vostroya do not even know what happened anymore. They remember that they had betrayed the Emperor. So much is left to motivate them to continue this endless drudge. But one must remember that this is the Imperium of Man. Since the Horus Heresy, superstition and stupidity, regression, almost out of spite, has occurred. As the powers that be have decided, for good or evil, that the populace should never truly know of chaos, the dark gods, demons, and what they did. History itself has been eradicated and falsified again and again by various elements within the Imperium for millennia on end. Hence none now remember that Horus turned to chaos. He is just a traitor, a boogeyman. Even on Vostroya itself, none are permitted to know the circumstances that drew down the curse of Guilliman on them, what they actually did wrong and why. So all that is left is the vaguest of myths and ongoing cultural guilt that they are betrayers to their emperor, and they sacrificed their firstborn sons to him and have done for 10,000 years or more, just to attempt to remove this blemish. A blemish they no longer even know how they gained. The world of Vostroya. Located in the halo zone of the Segmentum Obscurus, it is further from Holy Terra, Earth, than the Eye of Terra, orbited by a single moon called Totolsky. Vostroya is a minerally rich planet, even after such a duration of near-constant mining and processing, although I would wager the resources are certainly sent by surrounding planets to shore up this output. It is an industrial hub of prodigious production, and this has taken an effect on its landscape, as is so often true in the grim darkness of the future, for there is no consideration to sustainability or the greater weal. Hence there is now such climate devastation that much of the world is barren and harsh. Constant ash falls from the skies, with or without the snow in much of the world. Perhaps it is not in the league of an Astartes recruitment world, such as Fenris or Baal, but huge swathes of it are not hospitable. No agriculture of any sort occurs there due to this. Hence Vostroya is on a steady supply of consumables from the greater sector surrounding it. Old derelict cities dot the zones that fall prey to the harshest of conditions. Here the firstborn recruits are sent to train in the cold, bleak, barren sepulchres that were once so teeming with life. Urban settings, long uninhabited. Only in the equatorial belt is there any habitation outside of the hive cities. The world is divided into 7 managed zones, which administrate every hive and city and its production. It is a highly stratified and doggedly rigid society. One is born into a family of high or low birth, aristocracy, or tantamount to serfdom. There is hardly any social movement, and this can only be found in rare occasions amongst the bravest low-born soldiers who may just gain a position as a non-commissioned officer, a sergeant, etc. But the vast majority of all ranks, even outside of officer, are gained by those of higher social standing. For like a feudal aristocracy, it is in station that command is gained. But for those who command on the field of battle cannot be those who take orders from their betters when off of it, not for the firstborn. Historically, this has invariably always led to incompetence, group overestimation of their own worth and talent, and the age-old saying of many a good army, lions led by donkeys. But the firstborn somehow managed to remove this from the equation. Although command can only be gained by those who already possess high rank, the amount of candidates hailing from high strata means that there is plenty of room for maneuver. Hence the utterly incompetent do not make it out of training, and those who have potential soon learn to hone it. They have no choice. But their basic training continues far further than near any other regiment under the Imperium's banners. This now brings us on to one of the other distinguishing features of this legendary regiment, for they are utterly different to nearly all other forces that make up the Astra Militarum. It comes from one decision, one act that sets them utterly apart. An after effect of the curse of Guilliman that has such positive effects that it is a wonder that the Departmentum Munitorum has not made it standard practice. Something that will always baffle me. But what is it?
My fate was decided by my parents. They fought hard, racing against their siblings. Married second, but only by a month. They conceived first, and I was a son, a firstborn son. My task, to carry the honor of my family, to join the finest regiment in the Imperium. I was to be a Vostroyan Firstborn. My weapon, an heirloom of the finest construction, the filigree on the stock, the enhanced scope, the well-worn trigger that needed caressing, not yanking. My sword is of the finest alloy. It had cut waves of fire before it reached my care. I am an officer. I am a soldier. I am Vostroya's pride. I am her guilt. I am her price. I am her wrath. I served under my uncle. He was a fine soldier, a better officer, a born leader of men. I learned a lot from him.
The Vostroyans reinforced their regiments. That's it. Something we would now take for granted. Something so decidedly logical. Yet in the mad and twisted regime of the Imperium, it is the exception that proves the rule. For the price of life is so cheap, so bloody cheap, that there is simply no regard for it. None. This is shown in a myriad of ways, but in the Astra Militarum, the Imperial Guard, it is exhibited so callously that I cannot fathom it myself. For when a regiment of men and women has met the enemy, has taken often horrific casualties, has striven against insurmountable odds against all forms of horror, it is not necessarily lauded, acclaimed, or awarded. No. When a regiment is reduced to low numbers, it is merely merged with another unit or formation. Its original designation, banners, and history are simply swept away. The army might take pride in where it comes from, how it was trained, even its ethno-group one supposes. But there can be no pride in the unit, in the actual regiment. For as soon as it has spent even half its lifeblood, it will simply cease to exist. And in a world that is so martial, this seems a fundamental mistake. It could well contribute in some not-so-small part to the vast majority of the regiments raised from worlds to be such utter cannon fodder. Barely trained, given the standard equipment of the foot soldiery of the Imperium, and launched into combat. Simply thrown at walls, parapets, reaches, Xenos monsters and orc wars, until they either become veterans, or much more often, bloodily expire. For the billions of humans expended in the wars of the Imperium desensitize all that are involved to such an extent that even numbers like hundreds of thousands, or even millions of guardsmen and women dying, is simply another rank on the abacus to be shifted from existing resources to expended resources. Thus it is that the named regiments are so legendary, considered elite from grunt to general, by simple dint of them being adequately trained and equipped. But for the lowest menials in the hives of Vostroya, the life of a firstborn is not to be sniffed at. The chance at glory, and potentially even to become an NCO, a non-commissioned officer, is worth 10 lives doubled over by fatigue and brutal working conditions that break the spirit as fast as the body. The Vostroyan regiments are so different, because they have such ties to the Adeptus Mechanicus, is one perspective, or because their shared goal, their shared guilt, is another. But unlike Krieg, they have no cult of sacrifice. They are frugal with their resources, careful with their men, willing to invest in them with all of the care of a Magos on his latest technological trinket. And because of this, they train their men to a degree that only other regiments of renown can even comprehend. For the merest act of reinforcing their regiments means that old grizzled veterans are always the core of any formation. The new fresh faces that arrive each generation or increment of it are then taught, trained, guided by the existing longhorns. In this way, they maintain a military tradition of excellence that would not shame a Marine, if I am honest. And they are the only formation in the Guard that I can presently think of that have had regimental pedigree that echoes all the way back to the Heresy. For other worlds just churn out Regiment X+1, while Vostroyan Firstborn regiments can trace their lineage all the way back to the first century of the curse. And that means that their banners are varied and inspiring, their ethos so ingrained that they feel the weight of all of the generations of the people that have marched under those regimental names. Such legends like the old Erascables, the Void Shrikes, which we will get onto in a further entry. It gives them a platform on which to rest their world, a confidence in their own worth that leads to a professionalism that other regiments simply could not understand, and it lends itself to so many other bonuses. For the weaponry of the Firstborn are often heirlooms of great providence, as they do not lose, they do not run, they do not just return things to a static pile of surplus. No. The weaponry of a Vostroyan can be passed down to the line as it can be sent back with the supply ships that arrive with new recruits. It can pass from one generation to another in the same family, in the same regiment. For often an uncle, older cousin or father even, will be there if they have the skill to survive. It gives the regiments roots that keep them firm, the stability that leads to confidence and courage, resilience and determination. Now the reinforcement fleets can take a long time, as when a war zone is bested, the regiments will be moved on swiftly to the next hellhole. With communication the way it is in the Imperium, the reinforcement fleets will often have to follow the breadcrumb traces of the deployments of the regiment and hunt them down. But this also means that they will oft arrive when the regiment most needs them, at the end of a long run of battles in an extended campaign, bringing new vigour, new men, new faces and Ferrari for the fight, but able to be tempered by the old veterans. In this way do they truly earn their place amongst the great names in the Guard. Vostroyans are also better equipped than near any other regiment due to their homeworld being not only a factorum, an industrial world, but again, because of their ties to the Mechanicus. Krieg churns out a mind-boggling amount of men and munitions, but Vostroyan equipment is the best that can be gained for a guardsman outside of their Tempestus scions. Many Vostroyans are thus known to wear at least partial carapace armour, usually in the form of a breastplate, not just the flak vest of the lesser regiments. Many of the Firstborn will also have a lethal sword, forged to perfection, called a shashka, a single-edged, slightly curved blade that can be used for both slashing and thrusting motions. Their weaponry is always durable and functional, of course, but also precisely made, and often ornately decorated. Filigree on stocks and triggers, hand-cast stocks, and sights so precise that their use radically increases accuracy. They are simply better. And it is the merest act of being able to pass these weapons down to their relatives, those who come afterwards, that means that they are upkept and maintained with a care that would make a Cadian proud. Now the majority of Vostroyan regiments are infantry, who are posted to the most hard-fought engagements, urban fighting being one of their known specialities, a brutal and terrifying speciality to have, for it is an essentially nasty form of warfare, that few will take on if they can avoid it. Conflicts such as Stalingrad more than prove this assertion, I feel. Despite all of their ability, they can be as inflexible in their approach to war as any ultramarine. As with the ultramarines, who will adhere to the wisdom of the Codex Astartes, for the Vostroyan, their established ways of war are always to be implemented first and adhered to above all else, for they are as conservative in their methods as they are in the rest of their society, and the new and untested is not a thing that will be lauded amongst the ranks. For they know their ways of war have been sharpened over a tour of duty over 10,000 years in duration. And although the new recruits, the shinies as they call them, may have a head full of new ideas, it is the job of the veterans to show that their ideas are not original and have been tried before, often to utter failure. The well-oiled machines that are the Vostroyan regiments know what they need to do, when, where, and how, as they have that unbroken military tradition. One last oddity that must be addressed is that sometimes a regiment will actually return to Vostroya for a short period. This is rare, as usually they are so requested, so needed in the war efforts, that they cannot be spared at all. but on rare occasions there is no new theatre of war to set off to immediately. Or it may be on the direct course from where they were last posted to where they are going, and Vostroya is betwixt the 2 points. And in these sacred times, the entire population can come together to herald the return of their firstborn sons. There's gate pageantry, and celebrations can go on for days, if not longer. And this is so rare. For usually the regiments of the Astra Militarum, the Imperial Guard, are disbanded or absorbed, as we have heard. But even if they miss an engagement, or cleanly wipe the floor with a foe and come out of it unscathed, no other regiment is permitted to return to its home world. Once they are waved off to war, they are never, ever seen of again. And even today, in the era Indomitus, even with the Cicatrix Maledictum torn across the length of the Imperium, the Vostroyans have not only defended their own turf, but they have sent out the reinforcements they have always done, even to regiments deployed in the other half of the galaxy. Despite the hardship and difficulty, because Vostroya itself sits firmly on the dark side of the rift, where the light of the Astronomicon does not shine, in the Imperium Nihilus. Hence their men are thrown out into the darkness, and only the skill of the navigators and crews now relying on memory or antediluvian charts and maps can permit a positive result and get those men to where they need to be so badly to keep the ancient regiments alive, even in this, the darkest of hours. This could be seen as the residue of the curse of Guilliman, the fear of being perceived to have sat on the sidelines again, and thus incur an even greater punishment from the now active ROUBOUTE. But I like to think that their eon of service, of steadfast rigour, has more to do with it than any fear of further punitive measures. For their entire society is now as martial as it is industrious, from the highest born, all the way down to the lowest. Like so many of the worlds that exist in the grim darkness of the far future, the world of Vostroya is a tale of a world shattered by the ongoing drudge, the need to work endlessly every day without exception, just to stand still. Never to progress, never to thrive, just to exist. Yet it is a price they pay without complaint, for their society has altered so much with just that one paragraph, that one diktat from a man that is not a man, a being that is more akin to a demigod of myth, ROUBOUTE Guilliman. And they feel pride for their contribution towards the ongoing survival of the Imperium, which is, very really, the last best hope for the survival of the entire human race. They have stood on the firing line, dashed across no man's land, battled across the cold silence of the void, in every segmentum, in every sector of the Milky Way galaxy. They have remained a bulwark in these dark times, a thin red line, so to put it, that has never faltered, never failed, never broken. Nor have they only sent their men out across the stars, for their world, Vostroya, has been the target of no less than 18 separate invasions, and not one has stopped the people of Vostroya, its firstborn sons, from standing against the darkness. But now that the Primarch, ROUBOUTE Guilliman himself, has returned to the land of the living, now walks the halls of the Palace on Terror, some might say that they hope he gains one, just one, report with their name on it. And that against all odds, this son of the Emperor, so oft touted to be fair, that the avenging son will see the name of the world he condemned, Vostroya. That he will remember what he did, will check their resume, their history, and feel the weight of his words come crashing back down on him, as it crashed down on them so many millennia ago. That he will see the honour, courage, tenacity, and loyalty that these people have displayed for 10,000 years, and that he will look at his palms and see the red life's blood of an entire people's sons there, And finally, he will let them know their honor is returned. And on that day, their honor returned, their shame banished. The firstborn sons will still go to war, still sacrifice the best and brightest of their entire populace. They will never cease, never falter, never fail. But on that day, they will do so with pure, untarnished, unadulterated pride. And in the Emperor's holy name, they would have earned it.